I arrived home early from work to find my younger brother Tyler laughing intimately with my wife Sarah in our kitchen, his hand resting on her shoulder as she giggled at something he whispered. When I cleared my throat, Tyler didn't even flinch, just grinned and said Sarah was telling him about our anniversary plans. Sarah looked flustered, but Tyler acted like nothing happened. At Sunday dinner with our parents, everyone laughed when Tyler joked about stealing Sarah away with our mother Patricia, adding that Tyler and Sarah would make beautiful children together, while our father Robert nodded approvingly. Standing in that doorway watching my brother's hand linger on my wife's shoulder, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't the first time I'd walked into a scene like this, and the familiarity of it made everything worse. Tyler had always been the golden child, the one who could charm his way out of trouble and into everyone's good graces. At 26, he still carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything that mattered to him. I thought back to when we were kids and Tyler had accidentally knocked over my science fair project the night before the competition. Instead of taking responsibility, he'd convinced our parents that we should share my backup project as a team effort. When we won second place, Tyler got to hold the trophy for the photos while I stood beside him, smiling through gritted teeth. That was Tyler's gift, making everyone believe his version of events even when the truth was staring them in the face. Sarah and I had met during our junior year at State University. She was studying nursing while I focused on software engineering. What drew me to her initially was her kindness. She volunteered at the Children's Hospital, always remembered birthdays, and had this way of making everyone feel heard. We dated for 3 years before I proposed, and she said yes without hesitation. Our wedding 2 years ago had been everything we'd dreamed of. Small, intimate, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about our future together. But lately, something had shifted. 6 months ago, Tyler moved back into our childhood home after losing his job as a personal trainer at an upscale gym downtown. The official story was that the gym had to downsize due to budget cuts, but I suspected there was more to it. Tyler had always struggled with boundaries, especially when it came to his female clients. Mom and Dad welcomed him back with open arms, treating his unemployment like a temporary setback rather than a pattern of poor decisions. That's when Tyler started showing up at our house unannounced. At first it seemed innocent enough. He'd bring Sarah her favorite coffee from the boutique place across town, or he'd remember details about her work schedule that even I sometimes forgot. Sarah worked long shifts at the pediatric ward, often coming home exhausted and stressed about her young patients. Tyler seemed to have an endless supply of energy and attention for her stories about difficult days and demanding doctors. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had become increasingly uncomfortable. Mom would comment on how Tyler and Sarah both had such expressive eyes, while Dad would nod along and mention that Tyler had always been good with children, just like Sarah. They'd make these comparisons right in front of me, as if I wasn't sitting at the same table, as if my feelings didn't matter in their little fantasy world where Tyler was the perfect son-in-law. Last month, when Sarah had complained about her lower back pain from lifting patients, Tyler had immediately offered to show her some stretching techniques. I'd watched from the kitchen as he positioned her arms above her head and placed his hands on her waist to guide her movements. Sarah had smiled and thanked him, saying the stretches really helped. When I'd suggested we could look up some exercises online together, Sarah had waved me off, saying Tyler already knew what worked. The worst part was how Sarah defended Tyler whenever I expressed concern. She'd call me jealous and insecure, reminding me that Tyler was family and that he was going through a difficult time. She'd grown up with distant parents who divorced when she was in high school, and I think she genuinely loved being part of what she saw as a close, supportive family. What she didn't understand was that my family's closeness often came at the expense of common sense and appropriate boundaries. My mother, Patricia, had built a successful career as a real estate agent by reading people and knowing exactly what they wanted to hear. She'd always favored Tyler's athleticism and social ease over my academic achievements and quiet personality. When Tyler brought home girlfriends, Mom would gush about how perfect they were for him. When I'd brought Sarah home for the first time, Mom's compliments had felt lukewarm in comparison, like she was trying to talk herself into approving of my choice. Dad, a retired police officer, believed strongly in family loyalty and supporting each other through tough times. In his mind, Tyler deserved our help because he was struggling, and anyone who questioned that support was being selfish. Dad had always been proud of Tyler's athletic scholarships and natural leadership abilities, while my computer science degree and steady job seemed boring by comparison. But it was Sarah who worried me most. She'd grown up craving the kind of family attention she'd never received, and Tyler was giving her exactly what she'd always wanted. Someone who listened to her stories, remembered small details, and made her feel special. The fact that he was doing it right under my nose with my parents' enthusiastic approval made it even more appealing to her. The evening after I'd found them in the kitchen together, I'd tried to talk to Sarah about Tyler's behavior. She'd been getting ready for bed, brushing her teeth in our master bathroom, while I sat on the edge of our bed, trying to find the right words. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about Tyler." I'd started carefully. She'd paused with her toothbrush halfway to her mouth. "What about him? The way he touches you, the way he looks at you, it makes me uncomfortable." Sarah had spit into the sink and turned to face me, her expression already defensive. "Darian, he's your brother. He's being nice to me because I'm part of the family now. Family members don't usually put their hands on each other's waist during stretching sessions." "You're being ridiculous. Tyler was helping me with my back pain, which is more than I can say for you lately." That comment had stung because it was partially true. Between work deadlines and Tyler's constant presence at our house, I'd been distracted and less attentive than usual. But instead of acknowledging my shortcomings, I'd gotten defensive. "I'm working extra hours to pay for this house, Sarah. I'm sorry if I don't have time to memorize your work schedule and show up with coffee every day. Maybe if you paid half as much attention to me as Tyler does, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The argument had escalated from there, with both of us saying things we'd later regret. But what stuck with me was Sarah's admission that she looked forward to Tyler's attention. She'd finally gone to bed angry while I'd stayed up scrolling through her phone looking for evidence of something I couldn't quite name. That's when I'd discovered Tyler had been texting Sarah daily with inside jokes and memes about her coworkers and patients. The messages themselves weren't explicitly inappropriate, but their frequency and intimacy bothered me. When I'd confronted Sarah about them the next morning, she'd revealed something that made my blood run cold. "Tyler asked me not to tell you about the texts," she'd said, pouring coffee into her travel mug without looking at me. "He said he didn't want to cause family drama, and honestly, I agreed with him. So you've been keeping secrets from me to protect Tyler's feelings?" "They're just funny messages, Darian. He sends me memes when I'm having a stressful day at work. It's not like we're planning to run away together." But the damage was done. Sarah had chosen to keep Tyler's communication secret from me, prioritizing his comfort over our marriage's transparency. And the worst part was that she seemed genuinely convinced that her choice was reasonable, even considerate. As I stood in our kitchen that morning watching Sarah check her phone and smile at what was undoubtedly another message from Tyler, I realized that my brother wasn't just crossing boundaries, he was systematically replacing me in my own wife's life, one coffee delivery and inside joke at a time. 2 weeks passed, and Tyler's presence in our lives became even more suffocating. I'd started paying closer attention to his patterns, and what I discovered made my skin crawl. Tyler had somehow memorized Sarah's work schedule down to the minute. He always seemed to be at our house exactly when she got home from her shifts, lounging on our couch or puttering around our kitchen like he belonged there. The grocery shopping incident was what really opened my eyes to how calculated Tyler's behavior had become. Sarah usually did our weekly shopping on Saturday mornings before her weekend shifts. I'd been planning to join her that particular Saturday, looking forward to some time together without Tyler's interference. But when I'd gotten out of the shower, I'd found a note on our kitchen counter saying Tyler had offered to help carry the heavy bags and they'd left together. When they'd returned 3 hours later, both laughing and carrying what seemed like twice our usual amount of groceries, I'd felt like a stranger in my own home. Tyler had somehow convinced Sarah to buy ingredients for meals I'd never heard of, claiming he wanted to cook for us as a thank you for letting him stay in our guest room so often. Sarah had been glowing with excitement about Tyler's dinner plans, describing dishes he'd promised to prepare, while I stood there feeling completely excluded from decisions about our own household. The family barbecue at my parents' house the following weekend had been even worse. Tyler had spent the entire afternoon hovering around Sarah, complimenting her sundress and making jokes about my dad bod while I'd been manning the grill. Every time I'd looked over, Tyler had been making Sarah laugh with some story or observation, his hand finding reasons to touch her arm or shoulder. The worst part had been when he'd loudly announced that Sarah's smile could light up any room while looking pointedly at me and adding that some people were lucky enough to come home to sunshine every day. Mom had been taking photos throughout the afternoon, but I'd noticed that most of them featured Tyler and Sarah together. Later that evening, I'd discovered she'd posted several of these pictures on her social media accounts, with captions that made my stomach turn. One photo showed Tyler and Sarah sitting close together on the patio swing, both laughing at something off camera. Mom's caption read, "My beautiful daughter-in-law and handsome son enjoying family time. Some people are just naturally photogenic together." The comments on that post had been brutal. Family, friends, and distant relatives had responded with heart-eyed emojis and remarks about what a lovely couple Tyler and Sarah made. Aunt Louise had written, "They both have such beautiful smiles. You're so lucky to have such gorgeous kids." Uncle Frank had added, "Tyler sure knows how to pick the pretty ones." When I'd shown the post to Sarah later that night, she'd shrugged it off as harmless family teasing. But I'd noticed she hadn't asked Mom to take it down, and she'd even liked several of the comments herself. My co-workers had started noticing too. Marco, who'd been my closest friend since we'd started at the software company together 4 years ago, had pulled me aside during lunch on Monday with a concerned expression. "Hey man, I saw some pictures online this weekend," he'd said carefully. "Is everything okay at home?" Marco's question had forced me to confront how public Tyler's pursuit of Sarah had become. My brother wasn't just crossing boundaries in private. He was doing it openly with our parents' encouragement and Sarah's apparent cooperation. The humiliation of having my marriage problems displayed on social media for everyone to see had been almost unbearable. But the real breaking point had come when Sarah started making comparisons between Tyler and me. It had started subtly. Little comments about how Tyler really listened when she talked about work, or how he remembered that she preferred daisies to roses. But the comparisons had grown bolder and more hurtful as the weeks went on. Tyler asked me about Mrs. Henderson's surgery today. She'd mention over dinner. He actually remembers my patients' names. Or, Tyler noticed I was stressed and brought me those tea packets I like. He pays attention to details. The implication was always clear. Tyler was doing things that I, as her husband, should be doing, but wasn't. And the worst part was that when I'd tried to recreate Tyler's gestures, bringing her flowers, asking about specific patients, remembering small preferences, Sarah had dismissed my efforts as forced or insincere. "It feels weird when you do it," she'd said after I'd surprised her with her favorite coffee one morning. "Like you're trying too hard to be someone you're not." But when Tyler did exactly the same things, they were natural and thoughtful. The double standard was maddening, but pointing it out only made Sarah more defensive of Tyler and more critical of me. Jennifer, Sarah's best friend and co-worker at the hospital, had started asking questions too. Sarah had mentioned that Jennifer had pulled her aside during their shift to ask about Tyler's frequent visits to the pediatric ward. Apparently, Tyler had been showing up with lunch for Sarah's entire nursing unit, charming the staff and patients alike with his friendly personality and natural way with children. "Jennifer's just jealous because her husband never does romantic things like that," Sarah had explained when I'd asked about Jennifer's concerns. But I could tell that even Sarah was starting to feel uncomfortable with the attention Tyler's visits were generating at her workplace. That's when I'd started digging deeper into Tyler's situation. I'd called the gym where he'd supposedly been laid off, claiming I was a reference for a job application. The manager I'd spoken with had been surprisingly candid about Tyler's departure. "Let's just say Tyler had some difficulty maintaining professional boundaries with clients," the manager had told me. We received multiple complaints about inappropriate behavior and we had to let him go. So Tyler hadn't been the victim of budget cuts after all. He'd been fired for exactly the kind of behavior he was now displaying with Sarah. The pattern was becoming clear, but when I'd tried to share this information with Sarah, she'd accused me of trying to sabotage Tyler because I was jealous of their friendship. The evening that everything came to a head, I'd come home from work to find Tyler and Sarah dancing in our living room. Not just any dancing. They'd been swaying slowly to our wedding song, Tyler's arms wrapped around Sarah's waist while she rested her head against his shoulder. The sight of them moving together so intimately to the music that was supposed to be special for Sarah and me had felt like a physical blow. When I'd cleared my throat loudly, they'd separated, but neither of them had looked particularly guilty or embarrassed. Tyler had smiled at me with that easy confidence that had always made me feel inferior, while Sarah had smoothed down her hair and tried to act casual. "We were just practicing," Sarah had said quickly, "for your parents' anniversary party next month." Tyler had nodded enthusiastically. "Mom wants family members to perform, and Sarah mentioned that you never dance with her anymore, so I offered to help her practice." The casual cruelty of that statement had taken my breath away. Tyler had not only been dancing with my wife to our wedding song, but he'd also gotten her to confide in him about our private marital issues. And now he was using that information to position himself as the solution to problems he'd helped create. "We've been working on it for a couple weeks now," Sarah had added, apparently oblivious to how devastating this revelation was. "Tyler's actually a really good teacher. He used to compete in ballroom dancing in high school." Of course he did. Tyler had always been good at everything that came naturally to him, while I'd had to work twice as hard to achieve half as much recognition. Now he was using those same natural talents to charm my wife and undermine my marriage, all under the guise of helping our family. As I'd stood in our living room that evening watching Tyler gather his things to leave while Sarah talked excitedly about their next practice session, I'd realized that my brother wasn't just flirting with my wife anymore. He was actively courting her, building an emotional and physical intimacy that was replacing what Sarah and I had built together. And somehow he'd convinced everyone, including Sarah, that his behavior was not only acceptable, but admirable. The most terrifying part was that his strategy was working. Sarah lit up around Tyler in ways she hadn't around me in months. She laughed more, smiled more, and seemed more engaged and alive when he was present. Whatever Tyler was giving her, it was something she felt she wasn't getting from me, and that realization cut deeper than any of his individual violations of our boundaries. The night of my parents' 35th wedding anniversary celebration arrived with all the pomp and circumstance Mom had been planning for months. She'd reserved the back room at Castellano's, the most expensive Italian restaurant in town, and invited 43 family members and close friends to witness what she called her and Dad's triumph of true love. The irony of that phrase would become apparent later, but at the time I was too focused on my own anxiety about the evening ahead. Sarah had spent the entire afternoon getting ready, trying on 3 different dresses before settling on a navy blue cocktail dress that hugged her figure perfectly. When Tyler arrived to pick us up, he'd offered to drive since he claimed to know a shortcut to avoid downtown traffic. He'd brought a corsage of white roses that matched Sarah's dress exactly. The fact that he'd somehow known what she planned to wear and had taken the time to find a perfectly coordinated corsage had made my stomach clench with a familiar mixture of anger and helplessness. "Tyler, you didn't have to do this," Sarah had protested, but her smile had been radiant as she'd allowed him to pin the corsage to her dress. His fingers had lingered on the fabric near her shoulder, and I'd watched my wife's cheeks flush with pleasure at the attention. Every beautiful woman deserves flowers on special occasions. Tyler had replied, his eyes holding Sarah's gaze just a moment too long. Besides, I wanted to make sure my dance partner looked absolutely stunning tonight. The drive to the restaurant had been torture. Tyler had insisted that Sarah sit in the front passenger seat since she got carsick in the back, leaving me to watch from behind as they chatted and laughed together. Tyler had remembered that Sarah preferred classical music for car rides and had prepared a playlist of her favorite pieces. Every song seemed to spark a memory or story that Sarah wanted to share, and Tyler hung on every word like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. Castellanos had been decorated with white roses and gold ribbons, creating an elegant atmosphere that Mom had been photographing obsessively since we'd arrived. The round tables were covered with crisp white linens, and each place setting included a small card with a different quote about love and marriage. Tyler had somehow maneuvered things so that he was seated next to Sarah at the head table, while I'd ended up between Aunt Louise and my cousin Amanda, who'd spent most of the cocktail hour showing me photos of her new apartment. Dad had given a touching speech about the ups and downs of 35 years of marriage, talking about how he and Mom had weathered storms and celebrated victories together. He'd thanked everyone for coming to celebrate their love story and had raised his glass to toast many more years of happiness. The applause had been warm and genuine, and for a moment I'd felt hopeful that the evening might pass without incident. But then Tyler had stood up, his wine glass in hand and that confident smile lighting up his face. "I'd like to say a few words about true love," he'd announced, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Growing up, I watched my parents build something beautiful together, something that most people only dream of finding." Tyler had paused, his eyes moving slowly around the room before settling on Sarah with unmistakable intensity. "True love isn't just about finding someone who makes you happy." He'd continued, his voice taking on a deeper, more intimate tone. "It's about finding someone who understands your soul. Someone who brings out the very best in you. Someone who makes you want to be worthy of their affection every single day." The room had been completely silent, hanging on Tyler's every word. I'd felt heat rising in my cheeks as I'd realized that everyone was following Tyler's gaze to Sarah, who'd been staring back at him with an expression I'd never seen her wear when looking at me. "When you find that kind of love," Tyler had said, raising his glass higher, "you fight for it. You protect it. You never take it for granted because you know how rare and precious it is." The toast had been met with enthusiastic applause and several "hear, hear" responses from the older relatives. But I'd noticed that several people had been looking between Tyler and Sarah with confused or knowing expressions, as if they'd picked up on the subtext of his words. Mom had stood up immediately after Tyler finished, clapping her hands together with obvious delight. "That was beautiful, honey," she'd gushed. "And speaking of beautiful things, I have a special surprise for everyone tonight. Tyler and Sarah have been practicing a dance for us, and they're going to perform it now as a tribute to lasting love." My heart had sunk as the guests had turned their attention to the small cleared area that served as a dance floor. I'd known this moment was coming, but watching it unfold had felt like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Tyler had extended his hand to Sarah with a gallant bow that had drawn appreciative murmurs from the female guests. Sarah had accepted his hand gracefully, and they'd walked to the center of the room while someone had started the music. A romantic ballad that had been popular when my parents were newlyweds. But Tyler and Sarah hadn't danced like in-laws performing a favor for the family. They'd moved together like lovers who'd been dancing together for years, their bodies perfectly synchronized and their eyes locked on each other's faces. Tyler had spun Sarah gracefully, his hand guiding her movements with the confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. When he'd dipped her low at the end of the song, holding her suspended in his arms while she gazed up at him with obvious adoration, the entire room had burst into enthusiastic applause. "Now that's what I call chemistry," Uncle Frank had called out from his table, raising his beer bottle in salute. "Tyler, you sure know how to pick a dance partner." Aunt Louise had been even more direct. "Honey, are you sure Sarah married the right brother?" She'd said loud enough for half the room to hear, then had dissolved into laughter when several other guests had nodded in agreement. The comments had kept coming as Tyler and Sarah had made their way back to the table. Cousin Amanda had immediately started showing off the videos she'd taken on her phone, promising to post them on every social media platform she could think of. Several of the older women had cornered Sarah to gush about what a lovely couple she and Tyler made, while the men had slapped Tyler on the back and congratulated him on his smooth moves. I'd sat through it all with a frozen smile, trapped at the head table where everyone could see my reaction. Every compliment about Tyler and Sarah's performance had felt like another small cut, and the cumulative effect had been devastating. My own family was celebrating my wife's chemistry with another man, and there had been nothing I could do to stop it without looking like a jealous, petty husband. But the worst moment had come during the dance itself, when Tyler had whispered something in Sarah's ear that had made her smile widely and nod eagerly. I'd been too far away to hear what he'd said, but the intimacy of the gesture had been unmistakable. They'd looked like conspirators sharing a secret, and the exclusion I'd felt had been more painful than any of the thoughtless comments from my relatives. After the dance had ended and the applause had died down, Tyler had taken the microphone one more time. "Thank you all for that warm reception." He'd set his arm still around Sarah's waist. "I have some exciting news to share. Sarah has agreed to help me launch a new business venture, a fitness blog focused on couples' workouts and healthy relationships." The announcement had been met with more enthusiastic applause, but I'd felt the blood drain from my face. This was the first I'd heard of any business venture, and the fact that Tyler had made this announcement in front of our entire extended family had felt like a deliberate ambush. Mom had clapped her hands together again, her excitement palpable. "Oh, that's wonderful. You two could travel to fitness conventions together, maybe do some video content at different gyms around the country. What an adventure." Dad had nodded approvingly. "That's smart thinking, Tyler. Sarah's nursing background would add credibility to health and wellness content." Before I'd known what was happening, the entire family had been discussing Tyler and Sarah's business plans like they were a foregone conclusion. Someone had suggested they start with a couples yoga retreat in Colorado. Someone else had recommended they reach out to a friend who worked in social media marketing. The conversation had taken on a life of its own, with Tyler and Sarah at the center of everyone's attention and enthusiasm. Then Dad had dropped the final bombshell. "You know, Tyler, this might be the perfect time for you to move in with Darian and Sarah temporarily." He'd said, his retired police officer's practical mind already working through the logistics. "You could save money on rent while you get the business off the ground, and Sarah could help you develop content on a daily basis." The suggestion had been met with unanimous family approval. Everyone had thought it was a brilliant idea. Tyler could focus on building his business, Sarah could pursue her passion for fitness and wellness, and I could be supportive of both their dreams. The pressure to agree had been enormous, with 43 pairs of eyes watching my reaction and waiting for my response. "That sounds like a great plan." I'd heard myself saying the words, feeling like sandpaper in my throat. "We'd be happy to help Tyler get back on his feet." The lie had come easily born from years of family gatherings where disagreeing with the group consensus had been social suicide. But as I'd watched Tyler shake hands with Dad and hug Sarah in celebration of their new arrangement, I'd realized that I'd just agreed to let my brother move into my home permanently, while he pursued a business venture that would keep him closely involved with my wife on a daily basis. The rest of the evening had passed in a blur of congratulations and well wishes for Tyler and Sarah's new partnership. I'd smiled and nodded and played the part of the supportive husband and brother, while inside I'd felt like I was drowning. By the time we'd gotten into Tyler's car for the ride home, I'd been emotionally exhausted and filled with a rage I'd barely been able to contain. The drive home had been the longest 23 minutes of my life, listening to Tyler and Sarah excitedly plan their business launch, while I'd stared out the window and wondered how I'd lost control of my own life so completely. The silence in Tyler's car during the drive home felt suffocating. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone and occasionally showing Tyler photos that family members had already posted from the evening. Their quiet conversation about which pictures looked best and which quotes about love were most meaningful made me feel like an unwelcome observer to their shared experience. I'd spent the entire dinner watching my wife and brother perform their perfect dance, listening to my family praise their obvious chemistry, and agreeing to let Tyler move into our house permanently. The humiliation had built up inside me like pressure in a volcano, and by the time we'd pulled into our driveway, I'd been ready to explode. Sarah had barely made it through our front door before I'd confronted her about the entire evening. "What the hell was that supposed to be?" I demanded, following her into our living room as she'd kicked off her heels and set down her purse. What's supposed to be?" Sarah had replied, but her tone had been defensive, like she'd known exactly what I was referring to. "The dance, the business announcement, the way you two looked at each other all night like I didn't even exist." Sarah had turned to face me, her cheeks flushed with anger. "We performed a dance that your mother requested for her anniversary celebration. I'm sorry if you felt left out, but you're the one who never wants to dance with me." "That wasn't just a dance, Sarah. That was a performance of intimacy. You looked at Tyler like you were in love with him." "You're being ridiculous, Darian. Tyler and I are friends. Good friends who happen to work well together. Friends don't whisper secrets to each other during romantic dances. What did he say to you out there that made you smile like that?" Sarah had paused, her expression becoming guarded. "He told me about the business idea. He asked if I'd be interested in being his partner. And you agreed without even discussing it with me. First, your husband—" "I agreed to consider it," Sarah had shot back. "And I shouldn't need your permission to pursue opportunities that interest me." The argument had escalated quickly from there. 3 years of accumulated resentments and frustrations had poured out of both of us in a torrent of accusations and hurt feelings. I'd accused Sarah of enjoying Tyler's attention too much. She'd accused me of becoming boring and distant since our wedding. I'd pointed out that she'd been keeping secrets from me about Tyler's communications. She'd reminded me that I'd been working late every night and barely paying attention to her anymore. "You want to know the truth?" Sarah had finally shouted, her composure cracking completely. "Yes, I enjoy spending time with Tyler. Yes, I like feeling appreciated and listened to. Tyler remembers what I had for lunch 3 days ago. You can't even remember when I have early shifts at the hospital. So this is my fault. Your emotional affair with my brother is my fault because I'm not attentive enough." "Sass. It's not an emotional affair," Sarah had protested, but her voice had lacked conviction. Tyler is just easy to be around. He makes me feel interesting and valued. Things I used to make you feel before he started undermining our marriage." "Tyler isn't undermining anything. Maybe the problem is that our marriage was already broken, and Tyler just highlighted how unhappy I've become." That accusation had hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had essentially admitted that she'd been unhappy in our marriage and that Tyler had shown her what she was missing. The woman I'd loved and married was telling me that another man made her feel things I apparently couldn't. "Fine." I'd said, my voice cold with hurt and anger. "Maybe you should go stay with your sister Kate for a while. Give us both some space to figure out what we want." "Maybe I will," Sarah had replied, grabbing her phone from the coffee table. "At least Kate listens to me without making me feel guilty for having feelings." I'd watched in disbelief as Sarah had actually called her sister, asking if she could stay the night because we'd had a fight. Kate, who worked as a high school teacher and had gone through her own difficult divorce 2 years earlier, had immediately agreed to come pick Sarah up. But then Tyler had called Sarah's phone while she was packing her overnight bag, and everything had changed. Sarah had answered immediately, stepping out onto our back patio to take the call privately. I'd watched through our sliding glass door as she'd paced back and forth, gesturing animatedly while Tyler had apparently talked her through whatever emotions she was experiencing. When Sarah had come back inside 15 minutes later, her entire demeanor had been different. The anger and defensiveness had been replaced by a calm determination that had been somehow more unsettling than her earlier fury. "I called Kate back and told her I'm not coming," Sarah had announced, sitting down on our couch and folding her hands in her lap. "Tyler helped me realize that running away from our problems isn't going to solve anything." "Tyler helped you realize," I'd repeated slowly. "Of course he did. Darian, we need to communicate better as a family, all of us. Tyler is going through a difficult time, and instead of supporting each other, we're creating drama and tension." The way Sarah had suddenly started referring to Tyler as family and grouping the 3 of us together as a unit that needed to communicate better had made my skin crawl. It was like Tyler had managed to insert himself into our marriage as an equal partner with equal say in how we resolved our conflicts. But the real revelation had come the next morning. I'd left early for work, still angry and confused about the previous night's events. When I'd returned home for lunch hoping to continue our conversation, I'd found Sarah at our kitchen table with several photo albums and jewelry boxes that I'd recognized from my mother's house. "What's all this?" I'd asked, gesturing to the collection of family heirlooms spread across our table. "Your mom wanted to show me some family history," Sarah had explained, holding up a vintage bracelet that had belonged to my grandmother. "She thought I should understand the family traditions better, especially now that Tyler and I are going to be working together." I'd picked up one of the photo albums and flipped through pages of family pictures spanning several decades. Many of the photos showed my parents as young newlyweds looking radiantly happy during their early years together. But Mom had marked certain pages with sticky notes, and her handwritten comments had revealed information I'd never known about my parents' marriage. "Look at this one," Sarah had said, pointing to a photo of my parents at what appeared to be a formal dinner. "Your mom said this was taken during one of the hardest periods of their marriage when she almost left your dad." I'd looked more closely at the photo, noticing for the first time that my parents' smiles had looked forced, and that Mom had been wearing the same bracelet Sarah now had around her wrist. "She almost left Dad when, about 20 years ago when you and Tyler were in elementary school." Sarah had continued, clearly repeating a story Mom had told her in detail. "Your dad had a gambling problem that he'd been hiding, and your mom found out he'd been taking money from their savings account to cover his losses." This was news to me. I'd had no idea about any gambling problem or marital crisis during my childhood. My parents had always presented a united front, and I'd grown up believing their marriage was solid and unshakable. "Mom said she was ready to take you boys and leave." Sarah had continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing profound wisdom. "She'd even met someone else, someone who made her feel appreciated and understood in ways your dad wasn't capable of at the time." The way Sarah had emphasized those words, appreciated and understood, had made my blood run cold. These were the same words she'd used to describe her feelings about Tyler the night before. "But she stayed," I'd said, hoping the story had a redeeming ending. "She stayed because she realized that running away from problems doesn't solve them." Sarah had replied unconsciously, echoing the same phrase she'd used after her phone conversation with Tyler. "She and your dad went to counseling. He got help for his gambling addiction, and they rebuilt their marriage stronger than ever." I'd stared at the photos of my parents trying to reconcile this story of near divorce and infidelity with the couple who'd just celebrated their 35th anniversary, surrounded by family and friends praising their enduring love. "Mom wanted me to have this bracelet," Sarah had said, fastening the vintage jewelry around her wrist. "She said it reminded her of herself at my age, and that she hoped I'd think of her whenever I wore it." The symbolism had been disturbing. Mom was giving Sarah family heirlooms that should have gone to future daughters-in-law while telling her stories about marital problems and near affairs. It was like Mom was preparing Sarah for her own potential departure from our marriage while simultaneously welcoming her deeper into our family in a way that bypassed me entirely. But the most unsettling part of Sarah's revelations had been her obvious admiration for Mom's decision to stay and work things out. Sarah had clearly interpreted Mom's story as validation for her own feelings about Tyler. That being attracted to someone else didn't necessarily mean your marriage was doomed as long as you were willing to communicate and make changes. What Sarah didn't understand was that Mom's story might have been more confession than wisdom. The woman who'd nearly left her husband for another man 20 years ago was now actively encouraging Sarah's emotional connection with Tyler. Mom wasn't trying to save our marriage. She was trying to give Sarah permission to follow her own suppressed desires. As I'd sat in our kitchen that afternoon, surrounded by my family's history and secrets, I'd realized that Tyler's pursuit of Sarah wasn't just about his own desires. He had Mom's full support and encouragement, and now he had intimate knowledge of our marriage's vulnerabilities. Mom had essentially given Tyler a roadmap to Sarah's heart, complete with instructions on how to make her feel appreciated and understood. The bracelet on Sarah's wrist had caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through our kitchen window, reminding me that my wife was now wearing jewelry that represented my family's legacy of infidelity and broken trust. And Sarah had accepted it gratefully, seeing it as a symbol of belonging rather than a warning about the destructive patterns she was already repeating. The revelation about my parents' marriage had shaken me to my core, but it had also given me something I'd desperately needed: information. If Mom had nearly had an affair 20 years ago, and if she was now encouraging Sarah's relationship with Tyler, then maybe there was more to discover about my mother's past that could help me understand what was happening to my family. I'd started by calling my cousin Jason, who worked as a manager at First National Bank downtown. Jason was Mom's nephew, the son of her older brother, and he'd grown up hearing family stories that my brother and I had been shielded from. I'd reached him during his lunch break, and after some small talk about our jobs and families, I'd worked up the courage to ask about Mom's history. Jason. This might sound strange, but Sarah mentioned that Mom went through a rough patch with Dad about 20 years ago. Do you know anything about that? There had been a long pause on the other end of the line. Darian, why are you asking about ancient history? I'm just trying to understand some things about my family. Sarah seems to know more about my parents' marriage than I do. Jason had sighed heavily. Look, I was in college when all that went down, but yeah, Aunt Patricia had a really difficult time back then. Uncle Robert's gambling had gotten completely out of control. What exactly happened? Your dad was taking money from their joint accounts, lying about where he was going in the evenings, the whole 9 yards. Aunt Patricia found out when she tried to make a withdrawal for your school clothes and discovered they were nearly broke. This matched what Sarah had told me, but I'd sensed there was more to the story. Sarah mentioned that Mom met someone else during that time. Another long pause. Darian, I really don't think I should be the one telling you this stuff. Jason, please, I need to know. Okay, but this stays between us. Your mom was working at the bank then in the loan department. Her supervisor was a guy named David Williamson. He'd been divorced for a few years, had grown kids. Was everything your dad wasn't at that time: stable, attentive, financially responsible. My mouth had gone dry. They had an affair. It went on for over a year. Mr. Williamson was completely infatuated with her. He offered to leave the bank and move to another city if she'd come with him. From what I heard, your mom seriously considered it. The ground had felt unsteady beneath my feet. My mother, who'd spent the last 6 months lecturing me about family loyalty and supporting Tyler during his difficult time, had herself conducted a year-long affair while her own marriage was in crisis. What happened? Why did she stay? Honestly, I think she got scared. Mr. Williamson was ready to uproot his entire life for her, but your mom realized that meant she'd have to uproot hers too. She'd have to leave you, boys leave her family, start over completely. In the end, she couldn't do it. After I'd hung up with Jason, I'd spent the rest of the afternoon researching David Williamson online. Social media had made it surprisingly easy to find information about people from Mom's past. David Williamson was now 68 years old, retired from banking and living in a condo community in Sarasota, Florida. His Facebook profile showed photos of him playing golf, attending community theater productions, and dining alone at restaurants. But what had made my blood run cold was the discovery that Mom was still connected to him on social media. Not only were they Facebook friends, but they'd been regularly liking and commenting on each other's posts. David's comments on Mom's photos were always warm and personal, using phrases like, "You look as beautiful as ever," and "Some things never change." Mom's responses had been equally familiar, referring to shared memories and inside jokes that spanned decades. I'd scrolled back through months of their interactions, finding a pattern of communication that suggested they'd never really lost touch after their affair had ended. David would post photos from his travels, and Mom would comment about how she'd always wanted to visit those places. Mom would share articles about local events, and David would reminisce about activities they'd apparently enjoyed together during their relationship. Meanwhile, Tyler had indeed moved into our guest room, and his presence in our house had become even more invasive than I'd feared. He'd started treating our home like his permanent residence, leaving personal items throughout the house and establishing routines that revolved around Sarah's schedule. Most mornings I'd wake up to find Tyler already in our kitchen making coffee and preparing breakfast for Sarah before her early shifts at the hospital. Their morning routine had become sickeningly domestic. Tyler would have Sarah's coffee ready exactly the way she liked it, with her vitamins laid out beside her favorite mug. He'd pack healthy snacks for her to take to work often, including little notes with encouraging messages or inside jokes. When Sarah came downstairs in her scrubs, Tyler would have her jacket ready and would walk her to her car, sometimes giving her a hug goodbye that lasted just a moment too long. I'd started leaving for work earlier just to avoid witnessing their morning ritual, but that had only made things worse. By removing myself from the situation, I'd given Tyler even more uninterrupted time with Sarah, and their connection had continued to deepen. The evening I'd discovered Tyler's personal items in our master bathroom had been particularly infuriating. I'd gone to grab my toothbrush and had found Tyler's expensive cologne sitting on our vanity next to his hairstyling products and electric razor. When I'd confronted him about it, Tyler had just laughed. "Sarah said I could use your shower because the water pressure in the guest bathroom is terrible," he'd explained casually. "You don't mind, do you? We're family." When I'd checked with Sarah about this arrangement, she'd confirmed that she'd given Tyler permission to use our bathroom, but she'd seemed annoyed that I was making an issue out of what she saw as a practical solution to a minor problem. "It's just a shower, Darian. Tyler's living here temporarily and we want him to be comfortable. He's got his cologne and hair products permanently set up in our private bathroom. That's not temporary." "You're being petty. Tyler takes care of himself and he's trying not to be a burden. I think it's sweet that he asked permission instead of just assuming." But Tyler's consideration had felt calculated rather than respectful. He was systematically inserting himself into the most intimate spaces of our home and our marriage, always with reasonable explanations that made me look unreasonable for objecting. The breaking point had come when I'd discovered Tyler's notebook. I'd been looking for Sarah's nursing textbook, which she'd asked me to find while she was at work, when I'd accidentally knocked over a stack of Tyler's belongings on the guest room dresser. As I'd bent down to pick up the scattered items, I'd noticed a small leather notebook that had fallen open to a page covered with Tyler's handwriting. What I'd read had made my skin crawl. Tyler had been keeping detailed observations about Sarah's daily routine, emotional patterns, and personal preferences. The notebook contained entries spanning several weeks each one, documenting specific information about Sarah's moods, work, stress levels, favorite foods, exercise habits, and even details about our marriage that he couldn't have known unless Sarah had been confiding in him regularly. One entry had read, "Sarah stressed about Mrs. Garcia's surgery today. Brought her chamomile tea and dark chocolate. She mentioned Darian forgot to ask about her presentation to Dr. Peterson. Need to remember to follow up about her career goals." Another entry. "Sarah wore the blue dress today. Said it makes her feel confident. Darian never compliments her appearance anymore. Opportunity to be attentive where he's failing." Page after page had contained similar observations, creating a comprehensive profile of my wife's emotional needs and vulnerabilities. Tyler had been studying Sarah like a researcher, cataloging information that would help him become indispensable to her happiness. But the most disturbing discovery had been Tyler's phone calls. That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, I'd heard Tyler talking quietly in the guest room. At first, I'd assumed he was speaking with a potential employer or someone about his supposed fitness business. But as I'd listened more carefully, I'd realized Tyler had been discussing Sarah specifically. "The plan is working perfectly," I'd heard him say through the thin wall between our rooms. "She's starting to see how different we are from Darian. He's so focused on work and his own problems that he barely notices what she needs." There had been a pause, presumably while the person on the other end had responded. "Mom's been incredibly helpful," Tyler had continued. "She's been pointing out all the ways Darian takes Sarah for granted, and she's been sharing stories that make Sarah feel like part of the family in ways that bypass Darian completely." The realization that Mom had been actively participating in Tyler's manipulation of Sarah had been devastating. This wasn't just my brother pursuing my wife. This was a coordinated effort involving my own mother to undermine my marriage and replace me with Tyler in Sarah's affections. "Sarah's already starting to confide in me about their problems," Tyler had said. "She feels unappreciated and ignored. Darian's making this easy for me by being exactly the kind of husband Sarah's getting tired of." As I'd stood in our hallway listening to my brother discuss his systematic seduction of my wife, I'd realized that Tyler's behavior had crossed far beyond inappropriate flirtation into something much more sinister. He was deliberately manipulating Sarah's emotions, exploiting her vulnerabilities, and coordinating with our mother to create circumstances that would drive a wedge between Sarah and me. The next morning, I'd confronted Tyler about the bathroom arrangement one more time, hoping to establish some boundaries that might slow down his increasing invasion of our privacy. But Tyler's response had revealed just how confident he'd become about his position in our household. "Darian, Sarah, and I have talked about this," he'd said, not even looking up from the breakfast he was preparing for her. "We think you're being unnecessarily territorial about space that's going unused anyway. Sarah appreciates that I'm trying to stay out of your way while still being helpful around the house." The casual way Tyler had grouped himself with Sarah when discussing decisions about our home had been chilling. Somehow, Tyler had managed to convince Sarah that they were a team making reasonable accommodations for his temporary living situation, while I was the unreasonable husband creating problems over trivial matters. As I'd watched Tyler hand Sarah her coffee and vitamins that morning, both of them smiling and chatting comfortably while completely ignoring my presence, I'd realized that my brother had successfully positioned himself as Sarah's primary source of emotional support and daily care. In his mind, I was already irrelevant to Sarah's happiness. I just hadn't figured it out yet. What I'd initially dismissed as Tyler's inappropriate flirtation had evolved into something far more disturbing and calculated. The discovery of Tyler's notebook had opened my eyes to the systematic nature of his pursuit, but it was his escalating behavior over the next few weeks that truly frightened me. Tyler wasn't just attracted to Sarah. He was obsessed with her, and his obsession was manifesting in ways that could no longer be explained away as brotherly concern or family support. The workplace visits had started innocently enough. Tyler had begun showing up at the pediatric ward during Sarah's lunch breaks, bringing gourmet sandwiches and salads from the expensive deli downtown. But what had initially seemed like thoughtful gestures had quickly escalated into something more invasive. Tyler had started arriving with enough food for Sarah's entire nursing unit, charming her co-workers and supervisors while establishing himself as a regular presence in her professional environment. Dr. Peterson, Sarah's supervising physician, had mentioned Tyler's visits during a conversation with Sarah that I'd overheard during one of her phone calls with a co-worker. Apparently, Tyler had been asking detailed questions about Sarah's work responsibilities, her career goals, and her relationships with patients and colleagues. To Dr. Peterson and the other staff members, Tyler had presented himself as Sarah's supportive brother-in-law, who was interested in understanding her professional challenges. But I'd known better. Tyler had been gathering information about Sarah's work life, the same way he'd been documenting her personal routines at home. He was building a comprehensive understanding of every aspect of her daily existence, mapping out her emotional landscape so he could position himself as the solution to problems she didn't even know she had. Jennifer, Sarah's best friend and nursing colleague, had started asking more pointed questions about Tyler's frequent appearances at the hospital. During one of their regular coffee dates, Jennifer had apparently expressed concern about the amount of attention Tyler was receiving from other female staff members, and about the way patients and families were starting to ask Sarah about her handsome visitor. "Jennifer's just jealous because her husband works construction and doesn't have time to bring her lunch," Sarah had explained when I'd asked about Jennifer's concerns. But I'd heard uncertainty in Sarah's voice that suggested even she was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the attention Tyler's visits were generating. That's when I'd decided to install security cameras around our house. I told Sarah they were for general home security, citing recent break-ins in our neighborhood, but my real motivation had been to monitor Tyler's behavior when Sarah and I weren't home. What I'd discovered through the camera footage had been deeply disturbing. Tyler had been entering our house during the middle of the day when both Sarah and I were at work. Using the spare key that Sarah had given him for emergencies, Tyler had been spending hours alone in our home, going through Sarah's personal belongings, with the careful attention of someone conducting surveillance. The footage had shown Tyler in our bedroom opening Sarah's dresser drawers and examining her clothing, jewelry, and personal items. He'd taken photos of family pictures on our nightstands, close-up shots of Sarah's handwriting on notes and lists, and even pictures of our bed and furniture from various angles. In our bathroom, Tyler had photographed Sarah's cosmetics, hair products, and medications, creating what appeared to be a comprehensive inventory of her most intimate possessions. Most disturbing had been the video of Tyler in Sarah's home office, where she kept her nursing textbooks, continuing education materials, and personal journal. Tyler had carefully photographed pages from Sarah's journal, particularly entries where she'd written about work, stress, our marriage problems, and her feelings of loneliness and underappreciation. He'd also copied information from her calendar, her contact lists, and her work schedules, giving him detailed knowledge of her daily movements and emotional state. The realization that Tyler had been systematically violating Sarah's privacy while she'd trusted him with access to our home had been nauseating. But what had terrified me even more was the discovery that Tyler had been using this stolen information to manipulate their conversations and strengthen their emotional connection. I'd started paying closer attention to Tyler and Sarah's text exchanges, which Sarah had begun leaving open on her phone with increasing frequency. Tyler's messages had demonstrated an uncanny knowledge of Sarah's moods and concerns, often addressing worries or interests that she'd only written about in her private journal. When Sarah had been anxious about a difficult patient case, Tyler had texted her specific encouragement that referenced details she'd only recorded in her personal notes. When she'd been frustrated about a scheduling conflict at work, Tyler had suggested solutions that showed he understood intricacies of her job responsibilities that she'd never discussed with him directly. Sarah had been amazed by Tyler's intuitive understanding of her challenges and his ability to offer exactly the kind of support she needed. What she hadn't realized was that Tyler's insights came from his secret surveillance of her most private thoughts and concerns. But Tyler's stalking behavior had extended beyond our home and Sarah's workplace. I'd discovered that he'd been following Sarah during her errands, her visits to friends, and her recreational activities. The security footage from our house had shown Tyler leaving shortly after Sarah and returning shortly before she did, suggesting that he'd been tracking her movements throughout the day. When I'd casually asked Sarah about her weekend shopping trip to the outlet mall, she'd mentioned running into Tyler at the coffee shop in the food court. She'd thought it was a coincidence, a pleasant surprise to see him while she'd been taking a break from shopping, but I'd known better. Tyler had followed her there, positioning himself to create what Sarah perceived as a spontaneous encounter. The text messages between Tyler and Sarah had become increasingly intimate and frequent, with Tyler sending Sarah good morning messages that arrived before her alarm went off, and goodnight texts that came just as she was getting ready for bed. Tyler had somehow learned the precise timing of Sarah's daily routines, and he'd been using that knowledge to insert himself into the most personal moments of her day. When Sarah had received a promotion opportunity at the hospital that required additional certification, Tyler had immediately researched the requirements and suggested study strategies before Sarah had even mentioned her interest to me. When Sarah had been considering changing her workout routine, Tyler had recommended specific exercises and nutrition plans that perfectly matched her fitness goals and schedule constraints. To Sarah, Tyler had seemed like an incredibly attentive and supportive friend who intuitively understood her needs and aspirations. But I'd known that Tyler's support was based on surveillance and manipulation, not genuine care or friendship. The most disturbing escalation had come when Tyler had started testing physical boundaries with Sarah. Their morning hugs had become longer and more intimate, with Tyler's hands moving lower on Sarah's back and their bodies pressing closer together. Tyler had begun finding excuses to touch Sarah throughout the day, adjusting her necklace, brushing imaginary lint from her clothing, massaging her shoulders when she complained of stress. Sarah had seemed comfortable with this increased physical contact, interpreting Tyler's touches as natural expressions of their growing friendship. But I'd recognized Tyler's behavior as a systematic desensitization process, gradually normalizing intimate physical contact that would have been inappropriate between strangers. The evening when Tyler had finally crossed the line completely, I'd been working late in my home office when I'd heard voices in our living room. Through the doorway, I'd seen Tyler and Sarah sitting close together on our couch, Sarah's head resting on Tyler's shoulder while he stroked her hair. They'd been watching a romantic movie, and when the main characters had kissed, Tyler had tilted Sarah's face up toward his and pressed his lips against hers. The kiss had lasted only a few seconds, but it had been tender and intimate, not the kind of accidental or playful contact that could be dismissed as misunderstanding. When they'd separated, Sarah had looked confused but not angry, and Tyler had smiled at her with obvious satisfaction. I'd confronted Sarah about the kiss later that night after Tyler had retreated to the guest room. Sarah had initially tried to downplay the incident, claiming that Tyler had been comforting her during an emotional scene in the movie, and that the kiss had been spontaneous and meaningless. But when I'd pressed her for more details, Sarah had admitted something that had made my blood turn to ice. Tyler told me he's been in love with me since before I met you. She'd confessed, sitting on the edge of our bed with tears in her eyes. He said he'd been watching me around campus for months trying to work up the courage to ask me out, but then I started dating you before he had the chance. The revelation that Tyler had been obsessed with Sarah since college had explained so much about his current behavior. Tyler's pursuit wasn't opportunistic or impulsive. It was the culmination of years of resentment and desire that had been building since he'd first believed he'd lost Sarah to me. He said he spent the last 3 years regretting that he never told me how he felt. Sarah had continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He believes we would have been perfect together if timing had been different. I'd found Tyler's love letter hidden in Sarah's nursing bag the next morning while she'd been in the shower. The letter had been pages long, filled with detailed observations about Sarah's personality habits and dreams that could only have come from extensive surveillance and obsessive attention to her daily life. I know you better than anyone, Tyler had written. I've been studying you, learning you, preparing to love you the way you deserve to be loved. Darian sees you as a wife, but I see you as a woman with infinite potential and beauty that he's too selfish to appreciate. The letter had gone on to describe Tyler's fantasies about their life together, his plans for their fitness business, and his belief that Sarah's marriage to me had been a mistake that could still be corrected. Tyler had written about watching Sarah from a distance, memorizing her routines, and positioning himself to be available whenever she was ready to leave me for someone who truly understood her worth. I've been waiting patiently for you to see what I see, the letter had concluded. And now that we're living under the same roof, I can show you every day how much better your life could be with someone who puts you first in everything. Reading Tyler's letter had been like discovering that a predator had been living in our home, systematically stalking my wife, while convincing her that his obsession was love, and his manipulation was devotion. Tyler hadn't been pursuing Sarah despite our marriage. He'd been actively working to destroy our marriage so he could claim the woman he believed should have been his from the beginning. The discovery of Tyler's love letter had been the final piece of evidence I'd needed to understand the full scope of what my family was doing to my marriage. Tyler's obsession with Sarah was real and dangerous, but it was being enabled and encouraged by my mother's own history of infidelity and her desire to see Tyler succeed where she had ultimately failed 20 years earlier. I'd spent the next week carefully planning my response, gathering all the evidence I'd accumulated and preparing for a confrontation that would expose both Tyler and Mom simultaneously. The security camera footage, Tyler's surveillance notebook, the love letter, and the information about Mom's affair with David Williamson had given me everything I needed to reveal the truth about what was happening to our family. My conversation with Detective Rodriguez, a family friend from Dad's police days, had confirmed that Tyler's behavior constituted stalking and harassment under state law. The evidence I'd gathered, the unauthorized entry into our home, the photography of Sarah's personal belongings, the following and surveillance, would be sufficient for a restraining order and potential criminal charges if Tyler refused to stop his pursuit. But I'd realized that simply getting a restraining order wouldn't solve the underlying problem. Tyler's behavior had been encouraged and enabled by Mom, and Sarah had been manipulated into believing that Tyler's obsession was genuine love. I'd needed to expose the entire conspiracy and force everyone to confront the reality of what they'd been participating in. The Sunday dinner at my parents' house had provided the perfect opportunity. I'd arrived early ostensibly to help Mom with meal preparation, but actually to set up my laptop and establish a video connection with David Williamson in Florida. I'd contacted David earlier in the week explaining that I was Patricia's son, and that our family was dealing with some difficult issues that related to his past relationship with Mom. David had been surprisingly willing to participate in a video call, especially after I'd explained that Mom had been using their past relationship to justify encouraging inappropriate behavior in our current family situation. David had his own regrets about the affair, and he'd been concerned to learn that Patricia was still referencing their relationship as a positive example for other people to follow. When the family had gathered for Sunday dinner, I'd waited until everyone was seated and comfortable before announcing that I had some important news to share. Tyler had been sitting close to Sarah, their chairs positioned so that their knees were touching under the table. Mom had been beaming with satisfaction at their obvious intimacy, while Dad had seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension in the room. I've been doing some research into our family history lately. I'd begun setting up my laptop on the dining room table, and I've discovered some interesting information that I think everyone should know about. I'd opened the laptop and initiated the video call with David Williamson, whose face had appeared on the screen with crystal clarity. The reaction around the table had been immediate and dramatic. Mom had turned white as a sheet, her hand flying to her throat in shock. Dad had leaned forward, squinting at the screen with confusion and growing alarm. Tyler had looked puzzled, clearly not understanding who David was or why his appearance was causing such a strong reaction from our parents. "Hello, Patricia," David had said warmly, his voice carrying clearly through the laptop speakers. "You look wonderful. It's been too long since we've talked face to face." Dad had turned to stare at Mom with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Patricia, who is this man? How does he know you?" Mom had opened her mouth to speak, but no words had come out. Her carefully constructed facade of moral authority had crumbled in an instant, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in front of her husband and sons. "Mom, why don't you tell Dad about David?" I'd suggested gently. "About your year-long affair with him 20 years ago, and about how you've been using your relationship with him to encourage Sarah's emotional affair with Tyler." The explosion of shock and anger around the table had been immediate and intense. Dad had demanded explanations while Mom had tried to deny and minimize her past behavior. Tyler had finally understood that his carefully planned seduction of Sarah was being exposed, and his confident demeanor had evaporated into panic and rage. "You've been encouraging this." Dad had asked Mom, his retired police officer's mind quickly connecting the dots between past and present behavior. "You've been helping Tyler pursue Darian's wife because of some relationship you had decades ago." Before Mom could answer, I'd pulled out Tyler's surveillance notebook and love letter, placing them on the table, alongside printouts of the security camera footage showing Tyler's unauthorized entries into our home. "Tyler hasn't just been flirting with Sarah." I'd announced, my voice steady despite the chaos erupting around me. "He's been stalking her. He's been entering our house when we're not home, photographing her personal belongings, reading her private journal, and following her around town while pretending their encounters are coincidental." Dad had immediately recognized the seriousness of Tyler's behavior. His police training had kicked in as he'd examined the evidence, his expression growing darker and more threatening with each piece of documentation. "This is criminal behavior, Tyler." Dad had said, his voice cold with disgust and authority. "This is stalking, harassment, and breaking and entering. You could go to prison for this." Tyler had tried to defend himself, claiming that his feelings for Sarah were genuine, and that he'd only been trying to understand her better so he could make her happy. But the evidence had been overwhelming, and his excuses had sounded pathetic and desperate even to his own ears. Sarah had been horrified as the full scope of Tyler's manipulation had been revealed. The romantic gestures she'd interpreted as evidence of Tyler's intuitive understanding had been exposed as the calculated products of systematic surveillance and violation of her privacy. "You've been reading my journal," Sarah had asked Tyler, her voice shaking with betrayal and disgust. "You've been going through my personal things while I trusted you in our home." Mom had tried to defend Tyler's behavior, claiming that love sometimes required extraordinary efforts, and that Tyler's dedication should be seen as proof of his sincere feelings. But Dad had cut her off before she could finish her rationalization. Patricia, you've enabled stalking behavior because you're still carrying a torch for a man you had an affair with 20 years ago." Dad had said, his disappointment and anger palpable. "You've put our daughter-in-law in danger and destroyed our family's trust because you never dealt with your own guilt and regret." The confrontation had continued for hours, with tears, accusations, and painful admissions flying around the dining room table. Mom had eventually confessed to Dad about her ongoing emotional relationship with David Williamson, admitting that she'd never fully committed to their marriage because part of her had always wondered what life would have been like if she'd chosen differently. Tyler had been forced to acknowledge that his pursuit of Sarah had been obsessive and inappropriate, and that he'd used information obtained through stalking to manipulate her emotions and undermine her marriage. The love he'd claimed to feel had been exposed as possessive obsession based on fantasy rather than genuine understanding or respect. But the most important revelation had been Sarah's recognition that she'd been vulnerable to Tyler's manipulation because of genuine problems in our marriage that we'd never addressed honestly. Tyler had exploited real issues between us, but his solutions had been based on deception and violation rather than authentic care or support. Dad had immediately ordered Tyler to pack his belongings and leave the house, threatening to call his former police colleagues if Tyler attempted to contact Sarah or enter our property again. Mom had been given an ultimatum about seeking counseling for her unresolved issues and ending her inappropriate relationship with David Williamson. Uncle Frank and the other relatives who had made jokes about Tyler and Sarah being a better match had been forced to confront how their thoughtless comments had contributed to a dangerous situation. Aunt Louise had actually apologized to me directly, admitting that she'd been so caught up in Tyler's charm that she'd never considered how hurtful her remarks had been to Sarah and me. In the weeks that followed, Tyler had indeed violated the restraining order Dad had helped me obtain, showing up at Sarah's workplace and attempting to contact her through social media. His arrest and subsequent criminal charges had finally convinced him that his obsession with Sarah needed to end, but not before he'd spent 3 nights in jail and faced the possibility of serious prison time. Mom had begun individual counseling to address her unresolved feelings about her affair and her patterns of enabling inappropriate behavior in others. She and Dad had also started marriage counseling, finally dealing with issues that had been buried for decades, but had continued to poison their relationship and their parenting. Sarah and I had entered couples therapy as well, working to rebuild trust and communication that had been damaged not only by Tyler's manipulation, but by our own failures to address growing problems in our marriage. Sarah had also begun individual therapy to understand why she'd been so susceptible to Tyler's attention and to develop better boundaries in her relationships with others. The process had been painful, but ultimately healing. Sarah had come to understand that Tyler's knowledge of her needs and interests had been based on violation and surveillance, rather than genuine care, and that his solutions to our marriage problems had been designed to serve his own obsession rather than her happiness. 6 months later, I'd received a promotion at work that required relocating to a different city. Sarah and I had decided to make the move together, seeing it as an opportunity for a fresh start, away from the painful memories and family dynamics that had nearly destroyed our marriage. Our new home was in a city 300 miles away, where I'd taken a senior position with a technology company, and Sarah had transferred to a highly regarded children's hospital. The distance from our families had given us space to rebuild our relationship without constant interference or reminders of Tyler's stalking behavior. On our first anniversary in the new city, Sarah and I had danced together in our living room to our wedding song, the same song Tyler had used to manipulate her emotions and insert himself into our relationship. But this time, the dance had been ours alone, free from Tyler's presence and influence. As we'd swayed together in the lamplight, Sarah had looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Darian," she'd whispered. "I'm sorry I let him come between us. I'm sorry I didn't see what he was doing." "We both made mistakes," I'd replied, holding her closer. "But we fought for each other when it mattered. That's what makes us stronger." Looking back on the entire ordeal, I'd learned that sometimes the people closest to you can pose the biggest threat to your happiness and security. Tyler's obsession and Mom's enabling had nearly destroyed my marriage, but they'd also forced Sarah and me to confront problems we'd been avoiding and to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty and genuine communication. The experience had taught me that standing up for yourself and demanding respect from family members isn't selfish or disloyal. It's essential for maintaining healthy relationships. True family support means encouraging growth and happiness, not enabling destructive behavior or living vicariously through others' choices. Tyler's arrest and the public exposure of his stalking behavior had been humiliating for him, but it had also been necessary to protect Sarah and to send a clear message that obsessive behavior wouldn't be tolerated or rewarded. Sometimes love means setting firm boundaries even when those boundaries cause pain or disappointment to people you care about. Mom's journey through counseling had been difficult, but it had ultimately freed her from decades of guilt and regret that had influenced her judgment and her relationships with her children. By finally dealing with her unresolved feelings about David Williamson, she'd been able to rebuild her marriage with Dad and develop healthier patterns of supporting her family. As Sarah and I had settled into our new life together, we'd both realized that the crisis with Tyler had actually strengthened our marriage by forcing us to prioritize our relationship and commit to better communication. We'd learned to appreciate what we had together rather than taking it for granted, and we'd developed the skills to address problems before they became overwhelming. The final chapter of our story had been written when Tyler had sent Sarah a letter of apology nearly a year after his arrest. He'd completed a court-ordered counseling program focused on stalking behavior and unhealthy obsessions, and he'd gained insight into how his actions had hurt both Sarah and me. His letter had acknowledged the damage he'd caused and expressed genuine remorse for the pain he'd inflicted on our family. Sarah and I had decided not to respond to Tyler's letter, but we'd both felt a sense of closure knowing that he'd finally understood the severity of his behavior and had taken steps to address his problems. Forgiveness didn't require renewed contact or relationship, but it did allow us to move forward without carrying the burden of anger and resentment. Our story had ended not with dramatic revenge or miraculous transformation, but with the quiet satisfaction of two people who'd fought for their relationship and emerged stronger on the other side. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but protecting what matters most and refusing to let others define your happiness for you. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family loyalty conflicted with protecting your own relationship? How do you think someone should handle it when the people closest to them become the biggest threat to their happiness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear about your experiences with family dynamics and setting healthy boundaries. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming difficult family situations. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who might be dealing with similar challenges. Sometimes knowing you're not alone can make all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you deserve relationships built on respect, honesty, and genuine support. Never be afraid to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or painful. Your future happiness is worth fighting for.